Saint Lydwine of Schiedam, Chapter 1, by George Carl Huysmans. The state of Europe during Lydwine's lifetime was terrible. In France, first Charles VI reigned, then Charles VII. Lydwine was born in the same year that Charles VI, at 12 years of age, ascended to the throne of France. Even at this distant time, the years of his reign call up horrible memories. They drip with blood and reek of license, and in the light of the old chronicles, behind the dusty veil of history, 4 figures pass by. The first is a man of weak intellect, with pale face and hollow cheeks, with eyes now dull, now full of fire. He vegetates in a palace in Paris, his clothes overrun with vermin, his hair and beard swarming with lice. This wretched being, before he became demented, had been a familiar figure, debauched, irascible, and weak. It is the king, Charles VI, an imbecile, taking part in the wild debauches of those afflicted like himself. The second is an intriguing woman, an eccentric, unreliable, and imperious, wearing a headdress ornamented like a devil's head, with 2 horns, and a dress cut very low at the neck, and trailing after her a figure train of great length. She shuffles as she walks, shod in slippers with points 2 feet long. This is the Queen of France, the Bavarian Huysmans, who, absorbed in the writing of some unknown author, takes her place by the side of her husband she abhors. The third is a vain gossip, whom the ladies of the court adore, and who shows himself, at one and the same time, cordial and rapacious, affable and cunning. He oppresses the people, drains the money from both the countryside and town, and dissipates it in scandalous escapades. This is the Duke of Orleans, cursed of the people and denounced from the pulpit by a monk of the Augustinian order, Jacques Legrand. The fourth, a little wizened creature, taciturn, suspicious and cruel, is the Duke of Burgundy, familiarly known as John the Pitiless. All 4 wrangle, curse each other, quarrel, and make it up, executing a sort of devil's dance in the decay of the country, already half ruined by the insanity of its king. France is indeed convulsed. Paris is given to the atrocities of civil wars, and butchers and cutthroats as dictators, who bleed the bourgeoisie as if they were beasts. The country is overrun with bands of brigands, who overwhelm the peasants, set fire to their crops, and cast the women and children into the furnace of the mills. There are criminal hordes in the Emergats, the rapacious crowd of the Burgundians, and those who stretch their hands to the English to help them cross the Channel. The English do, indeed, disembark near Harfleur, march on Calais, and meet the French army on the way, in the county of St. Paul at Azincourt. They attack and have no difficulty in overthrowing, like ninepins, the long files of heavy knights, prisoned as they were in sentry boxes of armor, and fixed astride their horses, which are motionless, fast stuck in the heavy clay. And while that region is invaded, the Dauphin causes the Duke of Burgundy to be assassinated, who himself had had the Duke of Orleans decapitated on the very day after they had taken the communion from the hands of the same priests, and had been reconciled together. Queen Huysmans, egged on by the need of money, sold herself to the enemy, and obliged the imbecile king to sign the Treaty of Troyes, thus disinheriting her son in favor of the sovereign of England, who became heir to the crown of France. The Dauphin would not accept this deprivation, but, too weak to resist, he took to flight, and was proclaimed king by some adventurers in a manor house of Auvergne. The country was split into 2 camps, betrayed by the one, broken by the blows of the other, and pillaged by both. It seemed as if the kingdom of France was doomed when, at a few months' interval, the King of England, Henry V, and the King of France, Charles VI, died. But the struggle still continued between the 2 nations. Charles VII, timid and thoughtless, always with his back turned towards the enemy ready for flight, abandoned himself to low intrigues, whilst the enemy robbed him of his provinces one by one. There was really no saying how much would be left to France when the heavens were moved and Joan of Arc was sent. She accomplished her mission, repulsed the strangers, led the miserable monarch to Rheims for his succoring, and expired, abandoned by him in the flames, 2 years before the death of Lydwine. Thus, the condition of France at the end of the 14th and beginning of the 15th century was lamentable, for as though human enemies were not enough, other scourges were added. The Black Death ravaged the country and mowed down millions of her people. That disappeared and was replaced by the tack, an epidemic much feared for the terrible virulence of its cough. When this died out, the plague reappeared and emptied Paris of 50,000 persons in 5 weeks, leaving 3 years' famine in its train. And then, again, the tack returned and depopulated the towns still further. If the conditions of France were lamentable, that of England, who was torturing her, was hardly better. To the risings of the people succeeded the revolts of the nobles. The king, Richard II, made himself odious by his debauches and robberies. He set out to quell the troubles in Ireland, but was deposed, and the Duke of Lancaster, under the title Henry IV, was elected king in his place. Richard II was imprisoned and possibly starved to death. The usurper's reign was passed in moderating discords and discovered plots. He burnt, on pretext of heresy, those of his subjects who had displeased him, and dragged out the feeble existence of an epileptic, tormented by the plots of his son, who was eager for succession. He died at the age of 47, and his son, known till then as a drinker and a bandit, an associate of thieves and women, reveals himself on coming to the throne as a cold and imperious, arrogant beyond measure, and of a ferocious piety. The Pharisaism and cupidity of the English race are incarnate in him. He shows the harshness and prudery of the Protestant, and is at once an usurer, an executioner, and a Methodist parson, born out of due time. He renewed the campaign in Normandy, starved towns, falsified coinage, hanged the prisoners in the name of the Lord, and overwhelmed his victims with sermons. But this sport, in which he was to have been in at the death, grows stale when his army is decimated by the plague. He is, however, the victor at Azincourt. He massacres all those who cannot ransom themselves and extracts enormous sums from others. And whilst their fate is in the balance, he crosses himself, mumbles prayers, and recites psalms. Then he dies at the castle of Vincennes, leaving an infant heir some months of age. The infant's guardians, one violent and dissolute, the Duke of Gloucester, and the other vain and cunning, the Duke of Bedford, ravage France, but are completely routed by Joan of Arc, and dishonor themselves forever in burying her, that they may throw her to the flames after a dishonorable trial. After France and England, Flanders is taken in the flank and overwhelmed by the storm. The history of Flanders is intimately bound up with ours, and she too was wasted by internal struggles, for the commercial rivalry between Ghent and Bruges year after year strewed the meadowlands with bones and made the rivers run blood. Ghent reveals herself as a proud and obstinate city, peopled by the ultra-pious and by the eternally discontented. Her trade guilds make her a bivy of strikers, the camp in which the vile and seditious find welcome, and all the revolutionaries of Europe are in close communication with her. Bruges seems more civilized and less opinionated, but her pride equals that of Ghent, and her love of money is even greater. She is the great emporium of Christianity, and she appropriates greedily all surrounding towns. She is the implacable arbitrator. And if it is a question of a canal which will benefit one of these townships at the expense of the other, a hatred equaling that of cannibals springs up. The Count of Flanders, Louis III, tyrannical, vain, and prodigal, cruel too, and unlucky, threw himself against the people of Ghent and tried to break their obstinacy by persecution. Their chief, Philippe de Artevelde, marched against him, defeated him, penetrated to Bruges, and there killed for preference its richest merchants. After which he sacked the villages and despoiled the towns. The nobles of Flanders called on France for help. It was a crusade of the nobles against the working classes. Charles VI and the Duke of Burgundy crossed the frontier, were joined by d'Arvelle in the head of an army at Rosebeek, and charged the Flemings, who had foolishly linked themselves together in chains that retreat might be impossible. The Flemings were twisted and piled one upon the other, and suffocated in a very narrow space, without having been able to offer any resistance. It was a triumph of asphyxiation, a battle without injury, a massacre without wounds, a combat during which blood ran only from casques that are tapped, from the bursting veins of their crushed faces. Darvel was, happily for him, found amongst the dead, who, after the victory, the vilest passions were unloosened, the country was pillaged, and the women and children were murdered. Places unwilling to be destroyed bought themselves with gold. It was your money or your life for these nobles, who had trembled before a troop of undisciplined peasants showed themselves inexorable. The people of Ghent had recourse to the English, who disembarked to aid them, but gleaned most of the booty left by the French, so that this miserable country became a prey both to those who attacked and those who defended her, though neither depredations nor tortures sapped her incredible energy. Ackermann succeeded Darvel, and, supported by a troop from across the Channel, laid siege to Ypres. Charles VI dislodged him and took Bourges, in which he left no soul alive. Then, tired of these orgies of murder, he called a truce. Upon the death of Count Louis III, Philip of Burgundy succeeded. This terrible inheritance came to him by right of his wife. He renewed hostilities, and the massacres recommenced. Dam was reduced to ashes. The country called Quatemitra became a heap of ruins, and, as if these horrors did not suffice, religious quarrels were added to the interminable conflict. 2 popes were elected at the same time, who bombarded each other with a shower of bulls. The Duke of Burgundy stood by one of these pontiffs and expected his subjects to follow his guidance, but they refused. And Philip became irritated and decapitated the leaders of the recalcitrant party. Once more, the Flemings revolted. The churches were shut, religious offices ceased, Flanders seemed to be excommunicated, and the Duke, exhausted by these disputes, finally left in peace a people he could not control, and contented himself with exacting money in exchange for the liberty of conscience. Such was the situation in Flanders, and if we pass on to Holland, we shall see that she too was torn by incessant strife. At the moment of Lydwine's birth, Duke Albert, as Ruard or vice-regent of Hainault, governed Holland. Zeeland and Frisia, the provinces which were united under the title of Low Countries, he replaced the real ruler, his brother, William V, who had gone mad after his impious struggles with his mother, Margaret of Bavaria. Whilst he was under restraint, the country had fallen victim to a violent feud, and a desperate battle had taken place between the Red Caps, or the Hoaks, and the Grey Caps, or the Cabajules. These 2 parties, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines of the Low Countries, were the result of the war between William and the Princess Margaret, the one upholding the son, the other the mother. But these hatreds survived the causes which engendered them, for we find them still active in the 16th century. Directly he was named vice-regent, and Albert laid siege to Delft, where he subdued the sedition in 6 weeks, and then took arms against the Duke of Gueldres and the Bishop of Utrecht in a scandalous contest between father and son, which seems a fitting pendant to the rivalry between the mother and the son of the last reign. William V died, and Duke Albert was proclaimed governor of the provinces. The country, worn by these dissensions, prepared to rest, but Duke Albert was under the influence of his mistress, Adelaide de Poelgeest, and betrayed the Hoaks, whom had his son William caused Adelaide to be assassinated in the castle of La Haye, and then, fearing his father's vengeance, fled to France. But a rising in Frisia drew father and son together. Persuaded that the murderer was the only man capable of commanding his troops, Albert pardoned and recalled him. He disembarked at Koondir, and the slaughter was renewed. Frisia ran with blood, but would not own herself conquered. In the year following, she revolted anew, was subdued, and rose again, this time defeating the armies of the Duke and forcing him to sign a treaty of peace. In courage and tenacity, she may have been a second Ghent. This war was hardly over before another broke out. A vassal, the Lord of Arkell, declaring himself independent at the moment of Albert's death, William VI, who succeeded his father, marched against the rebel, vanquished his garrisons, and obliged him to submit. But the Duke of Guelders became mutinous, and the Frisians were once more in a ferment. Being very ill and at the end of his resources, William signed an armistice with them after they had captured the town of Utrecht and died, leaving, besides many illegitimate children, one daughter, Jacqueline, who succeeded to her father's place. The life of this singular princess reads like a romance. Her father married her at the age of 16 to John, Duke of Touraine, Dauphin of France, who survived his marriage but a short time, being poisoned. Jacqueline then almost at once married her cousin, John IV, Duke of Brabant, a man of small intellect, who had no regard for her, and insulted her by living publicly with another woman. She left him and fled to England, to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, with whom she was in love, obtaining a decree from Peter the anti-pope, pronouncing a divorce between her and the Duke of Brabant, and married the Duke of Gloucester. Hardly were they married when they had to return hurriedly to Holland to expel John of Bavaria, Bishop of Ligre, Jacqueline's uncle, who had taken advantage of his niece's absence to invade the States. This prelate was defeated and retired, and Gloucester, who does not appear to have been very devoted to Jacqueline, installed her at Mons and returned to England. The unhappy lady had to struggle with a network of intrigue. Her uncle, the Duke of Burgundy, held all the threads, and she felt herself entangled on all sides. All were against her. Her uncle, the Bishop of Liege, whom she had defeated, her second husband, John of Brabant, who had seized Hainault when she was unable to come to its aid, and Holland, imposed garrisons of his own campaigners from Picardy and Artois on her town. Jacqueline, who had counted at least on the fidelity of her subject in Mons, was betrayed by them to the Duke of Burgundy, and imprisoned in the palace in Ghent, where she remained for 3 months. But, profiting by a moment when the soldiers who guarded her were drunk, she fled precipitately, disguised as a man, and, reaching Antwerp, attacked Gouda. There she believed herself safe, and called on her husband for help. But Gloucester had forgotten that she was his wife, and had married again. He refused to intervene. Jacqueline decided to defend herself alone. She fortified Gouda, which the Duke of Burgundy besieged. She pierced the dike of the Issel and sheltered one side of the town by inundation. Then, making a sortie on the other side, she fell upon the enemy and cut him to pieces. But her triumph was of short duration. For the following year she made an unsuccessful attempt to take Haarlem by assault, and her partisans dispersed, whilst, in the instigation of the Duke of Burgundy, the true Pope declared that her marriage with the Duke of Gloucester null and void, and, in spite of the decree of the anti-Pope, pronounced it an adultery. Then all turned their back on Jacqueline, and, abandoned by those who had been faithful to her, she resolved, in order to save her liberty, to sue for pardon to the Duke of Burgundy. And, at Delft, she concluded a pact with him, by the terms of which she was to be recognized as his heir, yielded him her provinces during his lifetime. Her second husband having just died, she undertook not to remarry without the Duke of Burgundy's consent. But she was hardly free before she broke her promises, for she fell in love with Frank de Borsen, standholder of Holland, and married him secretly. Philip of Burgundy, who had had her watched by spies, learnt of this union. He said nothing, but drew de Borsen into an ambush, and interned him at Rupelmonde in Flanders. Then informed Jacqueline that he would hang de Borsen if she did not immediately and unconditionally surrender all of her rights in the Low Country. To save her husband, she surrendered all of her rights in favor of the Duke and retired with de Borsen, the only man she appears to have really loved, to Teylingen. There, in this tower, the chronicles picture her sad and ill, unable to console herself in her misfortunes, amusing herself by modeling little earthenware jugs, and finally dying of consumption at the age of 36, 3 years after Lydwine's death, without leaving any children by any of her 4 husbands. Such, briefly, is the story of Jacqueline's life. What exactly was this strange woman? Accounts differ. Some represent her as an adventuress and a libertine, other as tender and chivalrous, the victim of the ambitions of those around her. But in any case, she appears to have been impulsive and unable to resist the emotions of her senses. A more or less accurate portrait of her in the pages of La Flamboyante Colonne de Pays Bas shows us a vigorous Dutchwoman, something of a virago perhaps, but good-natured and energetic, though common and rough, probably imperious and headstrong, certainly versatile and brave. Meanwhile, poor Holland, under her government, had to bear the consequences of her love affairs. Sacked by the Burgundians, harassed by bands of hawks and cabbajoes, she suffered cruelly, whilst inundations which involved entire villages increased her despair. And finally, to crown it all, the plague appeared. Was the rest of Europe more fortunate and happier? It would hardly appear so. In Germany, where reigned a pretentious drunkard, the Emperor Wenceslas, who trafficked in state affairs and appointments, while his vassals destroyed one another. And, in order to secure peace, it was necessary to sweep away both him and his concubines. In Bohemia and in Hungary, fierce war was waged between the Slavs and the Turkomans, where there were also wholesale massacres of the Hussites. In the valley of the Danube was one vast charnel house, over which hovered the plague. In Spain, the natives and the Moors decimated each other, and a merciless hatred reigned between the provinces. In Castile, Peter the Cruel, a sort of maniac, killed his brothers, his cousins, and his wife, Blanche de Bourbon, and invented the most horrible tortures to torment his captives. In Aragon, Peter the Ceremonious stole the goods of his family, and practiced the most horrific cruelties on his enemies. The ruler of Navarre was a prisoner, Charles the Bad. In Portugal, another Peter the Cruel, mad with vanity and persecutions, had the heart torn out of those who betrayed after being martyred. Once, in an access of frenzy, he even disinterred his dead mistress, seated her, dressed in royal adornments, and crowned her with a royal crown upon a royal throne, and forced all his nobles to pass in file before her and kiss the hand of the corpse. Truly, the half-kindly madness of Charles VI seems almost reasonable when compared with the aberrations of these possessed beings. In Italy, there was civil war and plague, and in this general unloosening of scourges, ruffians hacked each other to pieces in the streets of Rome. The family of Colonna, its satellites, rose against the Pope, and, under the pretext of restoring order, the King of Naples possessed himself of the town, and having pillaged it, quitted it, only to return to pillage it again. Between Genoa and Venice, there was a conflict involving vicious reprisals. At Naples, Queen Jane was carried off to be suffocated between two mattresses in a castle of the Boscalate. In Milan, there were all kinds of atrocities committed between the various factions in rebellion. And, worst of all, the Church herself suddenly became two-headed. If the members of her poor body, the Catholic states, languished, sick, and bloodless, her two heads, the one at Avignon, the other at Rome, were more than ready to devour them. The Church was indeed governed by the most terrible pontiffs, and it was this epoch that the great schism in the East. The situation of the papal throne was as follows. The King of France, Philip le Bel, had at one time seated in the papal chair one of his own creatures, Bertrand de Got, Archbishop of Bordeaux. After having been consecrated at Lyons, the pontiff, instead of installing himself at Rome, chose to live in the Principality of Avignon, and with him began the period which the writers call the Exile of Babylon. Other popes succeeded and died without having been able to regain their states, until at last, in 1376, Gregory XI retook possessions of the Eternal City and died at the moment when, disgusted with Italy, he was preparing to return to France. After the death of Gregory XI, there followed two pontiffs, each elected by one faction and rejected by the other. Rome named one pope, and Avignon another, and Europe was divided into two camps. Urban VI, the Roman pope, was more honest, but the more imprudent and sanguinary of the two was recognized by Germany and Flanders and the Low Countries, England, Hungary, and Bohemia and Navarre. Clement VII, the Pope of Avignon, was gentle in manner, but unscrupulous. He practiced simony, sold indulgences, bartered benefices, and trafficked in favors. He was accepted by France, Scotland, Sicily, and Spain. The two pontiffs fought a war of interdicts, threats, and insults. They died and were replaced, and their successors excommunicated right and left, whilst the third pope, elected by the Council of Pisa, hurled anathemas at the other two. The Holy Spirit erred and strayed about Europe, so that it was no longer possible to know which pastors to obey, and the confusion became so great that even the instincts of the saint were at fault. St. Catherine of Siena held for Urban VI, and St. Peter of Luxembourg for Clement VII. St. Vincent Fier and St. Colette submitted at one time to the anti-pope, Peter de Lune, but eventually rallied to another tiara. It was the most absolute disorder that Christianity had ever been reduced to, and God consented to show the divine origins of his church by the disorder and infamy of his creatures. No human institution could have resisted such shocks. It was as if Satan had mobilized his legions and the gates of hell were open. The earth belonged to the spirit of evil, and he besieged the church, assailing her without respite, gathering all his forces to overthrow her, and yet she was not even shaken. She waited patiently for the saints whom God should send to release her. She had traitors in high places, she had horrible popes, but these pontiffs of sins, these creatures so miserable, when they let themselves be led away by ambition, by hatred, by love of money, by all the passions directly the enemy attacked dogma, the Holy Spirit, who was believed to have been lost, returned to their assistance. When it was a question of defending the teachings of Christ, and no pope, however vile he may have been, failed in this. It is nonetheless true that the miserable faithful who lived during all these horrors of the unspeakable years believed that all righteousness was crumbling away, and indeed battlefields surrounded them whichever way they turned. In the south, in the Christian Orient, the Greeks, the Mongols, and the Turks were exterminating each other. In the north, Russians and Tartars, Swedes and Danes were springing at each other's throats. And if looking further afield, across the ravaged territories of Europe, their gaze traveled as far as the line of her frontiers, the faithful seemed to see the end of the world drawing nearer, and the menaces of the apocalypse about to be realized. The boundaries of the Christian world are marked out by fire upon a lurid sky. Villages on the border of the heathen countries are in flames, and the zone of the demons is lighted up. Attila is alive again, and the invasions of the barbarians renewed. Like a whirlwind of Janissaries of Bajazet, the emir of the Ottomans passed along, sweeping the countryside like a cyclone and laying waste to towns. He throws himself on Nicopolis against the allied Catholic forces and annihilates them. The chair of St. Peter is in peril, and all seems to be over for the Christians of the East. Another victor, the Mongol Tamerlane, celebrated for the pyramid of 90,000 skulls, which he erected on the ruins of Babylon, arrived with lightning, rapidity from the steppes of Asia, falls upon Bajazet, and carries him off after having defeated his hordes in a sanguinary battle. Europe, aghast, looking at the meeting of the two waterspouts whose breakings inundated the onlookers as if it ran in blood. It is easy to realize the terror of simple people. How many of those who survived the disasters of this era lived on with troubled souls and wearied bodies, exhausted by panic and famine, by devil's dances, convulsions, rhythmic palsies, and a sickness called by the old chroniclers the madness of the head, which appears to have been meningitis, and, if not fatal, left the sufferers insane. In addition to all this, epidemics appeared and reappeared. The Black Death was raging in the East, and no region was entirely free from it. It infected Italy and France, England, Germany, and Holland, as well as Bohemia and Spain, and was the most dreaded scourge of all, continually overrunning Europe from those infernal reservoirs of the Levant. Soon, in the enfeebled bodies and in the souls unhinged by fear, Satan entered and inspired the impurities of nocturnal Sabbaths in the depths of the forests. The most execrable crimes and acts of sacrilege were committed, black masses were celebrated, and magic asserted itself. Gilles de Rais made away with little children, and his sorcerers plucked out their entrails, seeking in their remains the secret of alchemy, the power to turn worthless metals into gold. The people lay crushed both by what they heard and what they saw. They cried for justice and consolation among all these ills, but heard no answer to their prayers. They turned to the church with no better result. Their faith was shaken, and in their simplicity, they said that Christ's representative on earth no longer had divine powers, since he could not save them. They began to doubt the mission of the successors of St. Peter, so they could not believe in them. They were so human and so feeble. They recalled the disconcerting spectacle of Wenceslas, Emperor of Germany, always drunk, going on a visit to Charles VI, King of France, who was insane, for the purpose of deposing a pope, the Holy Spirit judged by an inebriate and a maniac. It was not surprising, therefore, that in such a time, besides the practice of Spiritism and Sabbaths, the most vehement heresies should arise and multiply from one end of the world to another. In England, John Wycliffe, a member of the University of Oxford and vicar of Lutonworth, denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, affirming that the bread and wine, after consecration, remained intact. He opposed the adoration of the saints, rejected confession, denied purgatory, and repudiated the power of the Pope. His teachings, which obtained an enormous following, united a crowd of madmen against the Church, and it was in vain that two Carmelites, Stephen Patrington and John Kenningham, struggled to oppose him. Wycliffe died, but his disciples, the Lollards, continued to propagate his errors. They penetrated as far as Bohemia, with John Huss and Jerome of Prague, who accepted the doctrine of the Eucharist on the condition that the laity were communicated under both species. They declared, however, that indulgences did not exist, that the papacy was the invention of men, and that the Church was the synagogue of Satan. John Huss was burned, as was his disciple, Jerome of Prague, but their partisans, whose numbers were augmented owing to the disorder in papal circles, set fire to churches and convents, murdering priests and monks, and the authorities attempted to reduce the Hussites to order without success. They defended themselves so bravely that King Sigismund finally signed a treaty with them to end the struggle. The Hussites broke into various sects. Thaborites, who declared vengeance to be a virtue and extolled the advantages of murder. Orebites, who were still more bloodthirsty and killed the faithful with horrible tortures. Adamites, who came from Picardy and went naked as our first parent. Later on, they developed into sects less fanatic and more sociable. And the Calixtans, that is to say, the faithful who partook of the chalice, and into the Bohemian Brothers, who, after having denied their real presence, detached themselves completely from the Church. In Italy, the sects derived from the old heresies of the Albingians multiplied. The remains of this heresy, which had flourished at the end of the 13th century, renewed the scandal of the Adamites and the Gnostics. All claimed to have obtained impeccability, and henceforth incest and adultery were permissible. It was useless to resort to destroying them by fire. They sprang up afresh. St. John of Capucin assailed them relentlessly, but in vain. They spread into Germany, where they became even more depraved, and in the 14th century one finds them in England, intermixed with the Lollards, carrying on a hot propaganda which only increased their sufferings. Whilst the popes excommunicated these heretics, a confraternity of flagellation was organized in Germany, spread to Alsace, Lorraine, and Champagne, and gained a footing in the south of France, at Avignon. These denied the virtues of the sacraments, taught that blood caused by flagellation was a valid matter for baptism, and proclaimed that the power of the Vicar of Christ on earth is void. In Flanders arose that series of errors known by the name of Walter Lollard, who began them, and extravagances were rife. A Benguine, Marguerite Porret, reconstrued the abominations of the Gnostics, and taught that to the creature absorbed in the contemplation of the Creator, all is permitted. This woman gave audiences, seated on a silver throne, and declared herself to be escorted by two seraphim when she approached the holy table. She ended by being grilled alive in Paris, whither she had gone to gain proselytes. In 1310, that is to say, many years before the birth of Lydwine, but the disciples she had won still poisoned Barbrant in the saint's lifetime. Another case was that of Blomerdine, or Blomedine, who died in Brussels in 1336, after having put herself at the head of the same sect and stirred up both North and South Flanders against the Church. Ruysbroek the Admirable, the hermit of the Green Valley, the greatest of the Flemish mystics, opposed them, but the virus left by the Gnostics filtered through into Belgium and the Low Countries. In 1410, when it was supposed to have worn itself out, it suddenly reappeared, and the heresy was spread far and wide by men who called themselves the intelligent. An unfrocked Carmelite, William de Hildernasian, a laic of Picardy, Aegis Cantoris, directed them. They were condemned and abjured for their beliefs, but in 1428 their heresies revived with greater strength than ever. They crept into Germany and Holland, and finished by joining forces with the always active members of the Fratellicists and Lollards, who then proclaimed the reign of Lucifer, unjustly expelled from paradise, and declared that he would now expel Michael and his angels from Eden. Nothing availed to eradicate these impious tenets. The Dominicans and the Franciscans were baffled by the tasks, and the disciples of Ruysbroek, his spiritual son Promerius, Gerard Groot, Pierre de Herenthal's, all tried to exterminate them. But the roots which they had torn up were reproduced with devilish rapidity, like the fungus growths in vegetation, or those parasites which flourish in the vegetation of the darkness in the sewers. Besides this more or less secret worship of the devil, there existed, too, in the Low Countries, the influence of doctrines corresponding to the errors of Wycliffe and of John Huss in England and Bohemia. The teachings of the partisans of the Reformation were already beginning to bear fruit. Jean Pépère de Gaulle, the founder of a convent for women at Malines, admitted no authority but that of the Scriptures, rejected the Council of Popes, laughed at the merits of vows, and decried the principles of the monastic life, while Jean Rouchat de Wissel cried shame on the sacraments, contemned extreme unction, and repudiated the commandments of the Church. So, too, did John Wessel de Groningen, whose works Luther later on borrowed his arguments against the values of indulgences. Thus was the Church sapped by heresies and torn limb by dangerous popes. But then, when Christianity seemed lost, God raised up the saints to stop the march of the evil one and save his holy Church. Even before the schism in the East, our Lord had imposed a mission upon 2 of his saints to warn his vicars to abandon Avignon and return to Rome. Saint Bridget was for this cause sent from Sweden to lead the sovereign pontiff back to Italy. While she was striving to convince him, he died, and another replaced him, who she also besought until his death. The third, indeed, Pope Urban V, listened to her and re-entered Rome. But afterwards, tiring of that town, he returned to Avignon, where he died. Bridget implored his successor, Gregory IX, to fly from France, but whilst he hesitated, she herself disappeared, and it was only at that instance of another saint, Catherine of Siena, that he determined to cross the Alps. St. Catherine pursued the work begun by St. Bridget and strove to reconcile the Pope with the Church, but Gregory XI died, and a state of schism followed with 2 popes elected, the one at Rome, the other at Avignon. The poor saint tried in vain to combat that evil, but God recalled her to himself in 1350, and she left this world in despair at the turbulent future which was preparing. It was now that God, in a vision, commanded a pious girl, Ursula of Parma, to repair to Avignon and invite Clement VI to abdicate. She set out on her mission, and this pope, moved by her exhortation, was on the point of yielding when the cardinals who had elected him opposed the measure. They imprisoned Ursula as a sorceress, and she was only preserved by an earthquake which dispersed her executioners at the moment they were preparing to torture her. God called her from the evil times on which she had fallen, and her enterprise came to naught. Until others of the faithful could succeed her in this mission, and until the saints under probation were old enough to follow Catherine of Siena, a tertiary of St. Francis blessed Jean de Maille, who had already tried to liberate France by testifying in the name of the Savior to Queen Huysmans and Charles VI, besieged heaven with supplications, added petitions in public worship, and organized processions in colleges and cloisters in the effort to repair the ruin caused by the papal disputes. But she did not have to take an active part in the conflict. She seems to have been vowed more particularly to works of mercy, to the care of the plague-stricken and the leprous, and to visiting prisoners, and the true succession to Catherine fell ultimately to 3 saints, St. Lydwine of Schiedam, St. Colette of Corbie, and St. Francis of Romaine, a Dutch, a French, and an Italian saint respectively. St. Lydwine and St. Colette were born in 1380, that is to say, in the year that St. Catherine passed away, and both gave their lives for the Church by suffering, in one case passively, in the other actively. Though leading absolutely different existences, their lives presented some resemblance. Both were born of poor parents, and from being fair to look upon became, by their own desire, ugly. Both endured ceaseless and agonizing pain. Both bore the stigmata of cavalry. Both, when they died, recovered the beauty of their youth, and had a sweet and pleasing smell. During their life they were both devoured by the same thirst for tortures. Only Colette remained, in spite of it all, active, for she had to traverse France from one end to the other constantly, while Lydwine traveled, if at all, motionless, on a bed. Finally, they resembled one another in that each was the savior of her country. St. Colette's mission was identified with that of Joan of Arc in repulsing the English. She helped with the superhuman comfort of her tears. While Joan took the material side and fought at the head of her troops, Colette took command of the spiritual. She reformed the convents of the clerisses, making ramparts of mortifications and prayers, and threw into the struggle the penitents of the nuns, clung to the skirts of the virgins, till she had obtained the defeat of Belford and Talbot, and the enemy had finally withdrawn. Lydwine, by the power of her devotions and her torments, protected Holland when it was invaded by the wastrels of Burgundy, and prevented a fleet from attacking Schiedam. Like St. Bridget and St. Catherine of Siena, St. Colette was called to combat a schism in person and by visible means. She intervened with St. Vincent Ferrier at the Council of Constance, and she tried, some years later, to prevent the Council of Pisa from introducing a false pope. Lydwine did not take, humanly speaking, any share of the tribulations of her unknown sister, who struggled so valiantly against erring cardinals and false popes. She could hardly have known, buried as she was in her Dutch village, of the distresses of the Church, except through such knowledge as her confessors possessed. But she certainly had revelations from the Saviour, and in any case the accumulation of her suffering was a treasure of war upon which, although doubtless of its source, both Colette and St. Francis of Romain drew. The latter was specially chosen for those tasks which schism rendered necessary. Younger than Colette and Lydwine by 4 years, Francis was of noble birth and allied to a husband who counted a pope and a saint amongst his ancestors. She differed then by her origin, her fortune, and her condition as a married woman from the 2 virgins, her sisters. But if she differed from them in some points, she emulated them in others, or rather she borrowed from both of them, becoming the spiritual child now of Colette and now of Lydwine. She resembled the Virgin of Corbie by her active life, by her vocation as a leader of souls and foundress of an order, by the part she assumed in the politics of her day, by the battles she fought with the demon who assailed her. She resembled the Virgin of Schiedam by her miraculous cure of the plague, by her perpetual contact with angels, by her voyages into purgatory in quest of souls to deliver, by her special mission to atone for the crimes of the period as a sacrificial victim of the suffering Church. By means opposed or by means identical, these 3 women, each bearing the stigmata, strove against the evil influences of their time, and accomplished an overwhelming task. Never indeed had the equilibrium of the world been so nearly overset, and it seemed as if God had never been so careful to adjust the balance between virtue and vice, and to heap up, when the load of iniquities preponderated, the tortures of his saint as a counterbalance against them. This law of equilibrium between good and ill is curiously mysterious when one thinks of it. For in establishing in it, the all-powerful appears to have wished the limits and put restraints on his own omnipotence. That this rule should be observed, it is necessary that Jesus himself should make some appeal to man. As reparations for the sins for some, he claims the mortification and prayers of others. And that is indeed the glory of our poor humanity. But, although he so respects the liberty of his children that he will not take away their power to resist him, never has God been deceived. All through the ages there has been found saints willing to pay, by their sufferings, the ransom for the sins and faults of others. And even now this generosity is difficult for us to understand. Besides our own nature, which shrinks from the suffering, there is also the evil one, who intervenes to frustrate the sacrifice. The evil one, to whom his most formidable weapons, money and the flesh. He also preys on the cowardice of man, who knows, however, that the grace of the Saviour will avail to assure him of victory, if only he tries to defend himself. Would one not say that after the expulsion of Adam from paradise, the Saviour, importuned by the rebel angel, had disdainfully granted him the most sure means of vanquishing souls, and that the scene in the Old Testament where Satan asks and obtains of God permission to tempt and try the unhappy Job had already been rehearsed at the expulsion from Eden? Since those times, the needle of the compass has oscillated. When it inclines too much to the side of evil, when man becomes too ignoble and kings too impious, God allows epidemics to be unchained, earthquakes, famines, and wars. But his mercy is such that he then excites the devotion of his saints, enhances their merits, even practices a little deception with himself, that his wrath may be appeased and equilibrium be established. Had it been otherwise, the universe would long ago have been in ruins. But from the resources Satan has at his command, and the weakness of the souls to which he lays siege, one can understand the constant solicitude of the Church, charged as she is with the task of lighting the balance of sins and continually adding a counterweight of arisen impenitence. One can understand the need for those ramparts of prayers and citadels of supplications which she erects at the order of the spouse, for the strictness of her pitiless cloisters and stern orders, such as those of the Clarisses, the Calvinaries, the Carmelites, and the Trappists. And one can even conceive of the incredible sum of suffering endured by the saints, those griefs within which the Most High distributes to each one of us to purge us and make us share a little in that work of compensation which follows the work of evil step by step. Now the dissoluteness of societies at the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th century was, as we have said, deplorable. The 13th century, which, in spite of its conflicts, appears in the midst of times so pure and blameless, which St. Louis and Blanche of Castile so chivalrous and pious, with all the faithful leaving all to snatch the sepulchre of Christ from the hands of the infidels. This century of vast cathedrals which knew Pope Innocent II, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Dominic, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, St. Gertrude, and St. Clare, was indeed little better than dead. Faith seemed expiring, and was destined, after dragging on through 2 centuries, to perish in that sewer disinterred by paganism, and known as the Renaissance. To sum up, if we examine the state of Europe in the days of Lydwine, we see cutthroat nobles seeking to destroy one another, the people reduced to misery by war and rendered either ferocious or insane through fear. Most of the sovereigns were either rogues or maniacs, like Charles VI, Peter the Cruel, Peter the Ceremonious, and William of Holland. Unbalanced like Jacqueline, drunkards and libertines like Wenceslas, Emperor of England, or cruel and Pharisaic like the King of England. As for the anti-popes, they crucified the Holy Spirit, and when we consider them, we are moved with fear. If only that were all, but one is bound to go further and admit that they were consecrated to God's services no better. Schism was rampant, and those to whom it had been entrusted to guide the bark of civilization were themselves steeped in sin. One has only to read the sermons of St. Vincent Ferrier, reproaching the turpitude, the invectitudes of St. Catherine of Siena, accusing them of cupidity, pride, and impurity, and of trafficking in the graces of the parcelet, to realize the enormous weight which they had added to the balance of evil in the scales of justice. Before such a total of sacrilege and crime, before such an invasion of the cohorts of hell, it would have seemed probable that, in spite of their courage and devotion, St. Lydwine, St. Colette, and St. Francis of Romaine would have succumbed if God had not raised armies for their succor. It is more than possible that they never had any knowledge of these armies, any more, indeed, than the armies themselves knew of their mission. For the Almighty is the sole master of the strategy, and He alone sees it in its entirety. The saints are in His hands like pawns, which He places on a chessboard of the world, and at His will. Their part is to abandon themselves body and soul to Him who directs them, and to do His will without asking to know more. It is only when one examines the resources made use of by the Savior and the diverse instruments which He employed that one succeeds in catching glimpses of the tactics by which He subdued the hordes led away by the rebel angels. The number of those militants who, at the end of the 14th century, took arms under Christ for the assistance of Lydwine and the 2 other saints can hardly be estimated. Some of them are known to us, others will probably always remain unknown, while others again appear to have been specially occupied in changing the scene of operations. Without fear of mistake, however, one can name the troops engaged in the first line, who had advanced under the shelters of the prayers offered by those mystic fortresses which were defended in France by the Clarisses of St. Colette. In Italy, the Clarisses of St. Catherine of Bologna were the cloistered tertiary Franciscans of the Blessed Angeline of Mariscano, the Reformed Dominicans, helped by Marie Mancini of Pisa, the Blessed Clare of Gambacorta, the tertiaries of St. Dominic, who adopted the cloister under the rule of Margaret of Savoy, the Cistercians whom Pope Benedict XII had brought back to a strict rule, the Chartreuse sisters who still revered the memory of St. Rosaline. All of these were interceding on behalf of the saints. The troops of the advance guard were formed by battalions of Franciscans and preaching friars. The first marched under the orders of St. Bernardin of Siena, who was born in the same year of St. Lydwine, and filled a mission like that of St. Colette in strengthening the relaxed rule of St. Francis. His disciple, John of Capriston, who sustained him in this task, was especially occupied in company with the blessed Thomas Blasio of Linares in opposing the heresies of fratricides and Hussites. Saint Jacques de Marche, who was joined with him to fight against the infidels, Saint Matthew of Agrente, who restored the ancient usages in the religious houses of Spain, blessed Albert of Santiano, who more particularly charged with the war against the schisms, were the leaders of the van. Those of the second line were led by Saint Vincent Ferrier, the miracle worker who evangelized the miscreants, by Saint Anthony of Florence, who struggled against the works of magic, by Blessed Marcellin, whose knees, from constant contact with the ground, became like the rotted bark of trees, by Blessed Raymond of Capu, pastor of Saint Catherine of Siena, who, with John Dominici and Lawrence de Ripafrada, simulated the lax piety and renewed the neglected customs of the religious, by Blessed Alvarez de Cordova, who worked for the extermination of schism, and in the same manner as Saint Vincent Ferrier converted idolaters. These troops, destined by the very nature of their vocation to the labors of the apostle, accompanied to the tasks of enlightening the ignorant, and prepared for the duties of an advancing guard, were extended like an interminable battlefront at the head of the immense army of the Lord, of which the two wings spread far and wide. One, composed of seasoned regiments from the Carmelites, was commanded by their prior, John Soreth, who quickened the fervor of his declining order and created the Institute of the Carmelites, by St. Anthony de Offen and Blessed Stanislas of Poland, who were martyred, by Jean Arunde, prior of the House of Bruges, by Ange Tuscany, by Bradley, raised to the bishopric of Dromery in Ireland, whose austerities were famous. The other wing was composed of the serried masses of the Augustinians, who had been rallied and reformed in Italy by Ptolemy of Venice, Simon de Cremona, and Augustine of Rome. In Spain by John de Alarcon, who introduced into the old Castile convents of strict obedience, while their third order had just blossomed into a flower of the Passion, Blessed Catherine Viscotti. In these newly drilled regiments, enclosed detachments that were weaker and badly armed, the Camadules, who in disorder of their ranks could still count a learned monk, Ambrose Trivari, and two saints, Jerome of Bohemia and the Apostle of Lithuania, and the Oblate Daniel, Brigatins, both monks and nuns, were hardly born into religious life and badly prepared to serve in a campaign. The Servites, whose discipline was being strengthened by Anthony of Siena, and whose standard-bearer was a tertiary, blessed Elizabeth Picarnati, the Prometarians, whose rule, like that of the convents of Fronteval, which Marie of Brittany was soon going to remodel, was so relaxed that their power to help was almost negligible. Between these two wings, behind the advanced line of children of St. Francis and St. Dominic, spread a mass of resisting strength, the bulk of the army, the dense and massive center of the most flourishing order of the Middle Ages, the Order of St. Benedict, with all of its great divisions. First, there were the Benedictines proper, directed in Germany by the abbot of Castells, Otho, who restored the ancient use of the order, and by Abbot Jean de Meudon, who converted the dissolute customs of the 147 abbeys. In Italy, by Louis Barbo, abbot of St. Justin of Padua, who resubjected numerous monasteries to the severe rule of the order, amongst them, such that Mount Cassin, the cradle of Benedictine rule, in France, the abbot of Cluny, Odo de Prévert, the cellarer, Etan Bonnedeau, and prior Dom Toussaint, a nephew of St. Colette, who was, by reason of his virtues, compared to Peter the Venerable, by William of Auvergne, cited in the chronicles as having been a veritable saint, by Blessed John of Ghent, prior of St. Claude, who imposed between the King of England and the King of France to try to induce them to make peace. Then came the Cistercians, led by the Blessed Eustace, first abbot of Jonardet, and by the Venerable Martin of Vargas and Martin of Logroño, who organized the Bernardine houses of Spain. The Celestines, who delegated most of their holy monks, Jean Bassand to be confessor of St. Colette, and who were all well reputed and very much relied on in France. The Olivetines, well seasoned, and led the assault by the Venerable Hippolyte of Milan, Abbot de Mont Olivet, by Brother Jerome of Corsica, who died in the odor of sanctity, convent of San Miniano in France, by the venerable Jerome Mirabelli of Naples, and by the blessed Bernard de Verchil, who founded 2 convents in the order of Hungary. Finally, there were the Humiliates, in whose cloisters we find the oblate blessed Aldobrascana, famous at Siena for her miracles. In enumerating this army, the chosen legion of recluses must not be omitted, those women who lived a hermit's life, which St. Colette had lived at Corbie for 4 years, the female anchorites buried in the deserts of the East, or voluntarily walled up in the towns, and to whom a little bread and a jug of water were passed through the opening in the door. The names of some of these holy recluses are known to us, such as those of Elise de Bourgat, interned in a cell in Paris, a blessed Agnes de Moncada, who, by the teaching of St. Vincent Ferrier, betook herself, as did Madeleine, to weep for the sins of the world in a grotto. Of the blessed Dorothea, patron saint of Prussia, who sequestered herself near the church of Kwizini in Poland, of blessed Julie della Rana, who incarcerated herself at Certallo in Tuscany, of Perrone Hergolds, a tertiary of St. Francis, who bore the stigmata and retired into a hermitage in Flanders, of Jean Bourdin, walled up in La Rochelle, of Catherine van Borsbeck, a Carmelite who buried herself in a sort of cave near a sanctuary outside Louvain, of another daughter of Carmel, Agnes, who was found some years after the death of Lydwine, still walled up in a retreat near the Carmelite chapel at Liege. These were the flower of servants of Jesus, the guard of honor of Christ, from whose ranks sprang St. Catherine of Siena, St. Lydwine, St. Colette, St. Francis of Romaine, and blessed Jean de Mal, all victims most particularly pleasing to God, the living effigies of the passions, the standard-bearers of the Lord, the stigmatized. In Germany, there was a tertiary of the Franciscans, Elizabeth the Good of Waldsegg, and the Clarice Madeleine Borler. In Italy, the tertiary of St. Francis, Luce de Nor, a Clarice Marie de Massa, a widow, blessed Julian of Bologna, the Augustinian, St. Rita de Cassi, the ecstatic Christian, whom the name, although what details, has been preserved by Denis the Carthusian. In Holland, there was the Dominican Bridget and the benign Gertrude of Oosten, and who can say how many more, lost in the ancient annals or fallen into complete oblivion. To those active troops may be added the soldiers attached to no regiment, who fought as partisans in their own countries, such as Blessed Peter, Bishop of Metz and Cardinal of Luxembourg, or St. Lawrence Justinian, Bishop of Venice. Those inflicted on themselves incredible mortifications to expiate the sins of their times, and among them were Jean de Kenty, the apostle of charity in Poland, Saint Jean Nepomucem, the martyr of Bohemia, and the Blessed Marguerite of Bavaria, a friend of St. Colette. Finally, there was a reserve corps recruited amongst voluntary laics and priests or monks who had not been carried away by the assaults of the devil. Thus, at the entry of this vast army into the war, marching under the banner of Christ, the scales regained their equilibrium between good and evil. At first sight, this army was imposing, but on closer inspection, it was evident that, if the chiefs who led it were admirable, the troops placed under their command were wanting in cohesion, irresolute and feeble. The bulk of the contingents were furnished by the monasteries and convents, and, as we have just seen, disorders and factions were rife within cloisters, rules were dying, and the greater parts of the statutes were dead. The phalanx of those serving had consequently no enduring piety, and were hardly exercised in the first steps of the mystic way. It was, therefore, before all necessary to reform the squadrons, to recall the religious to the forgotten use of their arms, to the practice of mortifications, and to restore their knowledge of the wiles of sin. The Carthusians were the only exceptions in this general deterioration. They were divided into 2 camps, but discipline was nevertheless intact. They had among themselves the clever strategists and powerful saints. Denis de Reichel, called the Carthusian, one of the greatest mystics of the period. Henry de Calar, prior of the monastery of Bethlehem Maria at Reutemond, and master of Gerhard Groot, has one of the writers to whom the Imitation of Christ has been attributed. Etienne Macaroni, the beloved disciple of St. Catherine of Siena, blessed Nicholas Albergati, who became cardinal after having been prior of the ascetics at Florence. Aldolf de Essen, the Apostle of the Rosary, who was director of Blessed Marguerite of Bavaria, and many others. The Carthusian companies formed a nucleus of old soldiers, accustomed to the fire of infernal battles, and they served as a rear guard, sheltering with the rampart of their prayers the translucent core of the army, screening the garrisons of pupils, the young recruits who had just been assembled, and giving them time to strengthen themselves and make themselves fit for the struggle. Amongst these recruits who composed the battalions of the reinforcements may be noted the handful of oblates of St. Bennet, founded by St. Francis of Romaine, and above all, a group of new Carmelites, raised for the service of mystic places by saints like St. Angela of Bohemia, who was cloistered in the monastery of Plague, Venerable Agnes Corietz, foundress of the Carmel of Sion at Bruges, Venerable Jean de Limoux, who created the monastery of Notre Dame and the Consolation of Villevorde, and was blessed one of the first spiritual daughters of John Soreth. Blessed Jean Scorpelli, superior of the monastery of Reggio, Blessed Arcangelo Gerlani, prior of the house of Mantua, whose incorruptible body had the power to heal women attacked by cancer of the face or breast. Lydwine herself was attached to no army, attached to no corps, and led no cloister to the attack of the miscreants. She fought in solitude, like a lost child from her bed, but the enormous weight of the assaults which she endured was almost more than can possibly be conceived. She alone was worth a whole army, an army which had to face an enemy at all points. Like other saints of her century, she gave herself in expiation for the souls in purgatory, for the abominations of schism, for the excesses of clerks and monks, for the delinquencies of kings and people, but besides the sacrifice by which she undertook to atone for the sins committed from one end to the universe to the other, she also bore the burden of scapegoat for her own century. As her biographers observe, whenever God sought to chastise Holland, it was to her he addressed himself first. It was she who received the first blows. Was she alone in the Batvian region to bear the burden of punishment for sin? Was she not aided by other saints in that special mission to the Low Countries, as she was in her mission to expatriates for the world in general? It seems almost beyond doubt that she was. The stigmatized, who we have mentioned, Gertrude de Usten and Bridget, no longer existed when she began thus to suffer by proxy, for the one had died in 1358 and the other in 1390. Thus they did not intervene in the proprietary work which she undertook. They began it, without knowing who would finish it, and Lydwine was simply chosen to be the legatee of their goods. She took their place as she had already done that of saints in the preceding century, a martyr of compensation, whose existence presents singular analogies to her own, St. Fine of Tuscany, who also passed her life on the bed and was covered with ulcers which exhaled the sweetest perfume. It is impossible to enumerate those persons in Holland alone whose merits lightened Lydwine's tasks. All that we know, but we know it by very sure means, which is to say the Chronicles of the Monasteries by Winsome and Mount St. Agnes, is that God saw fit at this time to raise up the southern provinces of the Netherlands an admirable company of mystics. There then existed a school of practical aesthetics, the outcome of the teachings of Ruysbroek, and the flourished in the region of Overyssel, more particularly at Deventer. A man of this latter village, who, after being converted by the prior of the Carthusians at Monnikhausen near Armen, became famous by reason of his sanctity and his science, was Gerard Groot, or the great translator of Ruysbroek, who preached at this time at Kampen, Zwolle, Amsterdam, Leyden, Zutphen, Utrecht, Gouda, Haarlem, and Delft, and fired the masses by his eloquence. The churches could not contain the crowds that he attracted, and he preached to them in the wind-swept cemeteries, affecting numerous conversations and filling the abbeys with his recruits. He, with his pupil, Florent Radwins, priest of Dentifer, ended by founding the institution of the Brothers and Sisters of Communal Life, which rapidly pushed its roots into the Low Countries in Germany. This order, which one would like to qualify with the title it never bore, the Oblates of St. Augustine, was a veritable center of study and prayer. The men were housed in Radwin's house and occupied themselves with transcribing the manuscripts of the Bible and the Fathers, and the women resided with Gerard, a kind of benign foundation, devoted themselves to needlework when not engaged in prayer. Gerard died in 1384 at the age of 44, while nursing the plague-stricken of Devonshire. After his death, Florence Radwins and other brothers, faithful to his recommendations, erected a monastery at Wittisam under the rule of St. Augustine. In this village, until then little better than an osier bed, gave birth to Holland, to 84 monasteries for men and 13 convents for women. These congregations of communal life were Cistercians and Carthusians, the only religious bodies who recognized their primitive constitutions, and they often averted the wrath of the Lord, whom the dissolution of the orders must have particularly angered. For, if we believe Rosebrook, Denis the Carthusian, and Pierre the Herentals, the disorder among the monks of the United Provinces in Flanders was frightful. It is certain that the mystic school at Devonshire supported by his prayers the work of Lydwine, who it knew and loved, for two of the Augustinians who belonged to it, Thomas à Kempis and Gerlach, wrote biographies of the saint. And they tell us, not content with submitting herself to be chastised as a substitute for the crimes of the universe and of her own town, she also consented to take upon herself the sins of persons who she knew, and the corporeal maladies which they found insupportable. This insatiable desire for self-sacrifice loaded her with ills. She was at one and the same time the tireless Danaid of suffering, a vase of sorrows, which she forced herself to fill without ceasing. The good farmer of Jesus experienced the torments of his passion, and the charitable suppliant who would pass 38 years discharged by the magnitude of her suffering, the debts of health and carelessness which others hardly cared to pay. She was, in a word, both a general and a special victim. This life of expiation would be incomprehensible if one had not indicated the causes and shown the number and nature of the offences whose reparation was in some sort the cause of her sojourn here below. But that foregoing sketch of the history of Europe at the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century explains the multitude of tortures which was unique to the annals of the saints. They surpassed, indeed, by their duration, the suffering of those of the elect, who, after perhaps short torture, the most glorious death of the martyr was allowed.